Even at my age, there's still time for me to get really excited about something that is brand new, at least to myself. I've had a urge to do things in a different creative way with different tools than what I've used up to this point. And after hearing the name and looking into how I could get started with it, I decided it might be interesting to learn Blender. What's more fascinating to me after doing this for a few weeks is not what I learned, but what I learned not to learn. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd, Jeff Atwood, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. Blender, if you haven't heard of it, is a 3D generation tool designed to make objects, lights, and then produce a scene that looks either realistic or intensely calculated. When I was working at a game company in the 1990s, I had to use 3D Studio, so I had some experience with how these sort of applications work. They give you a very simple plane, one you can rotate and look around at different angles, and then you can add a number of objects and lights and materials, then tell the machine to render it. Back in 1996, this was in every way painful. They were truly slow. Making a minor change could mean minutes or hours of re-rendering what you were looking at. I had been working with it as part of a pitch deck for a game that we were working on, and I was happy with what I did, but very quickly realized I did not want this to be my full-time job. So I dropped it. I worked with other programs that took my interest. I still had creative urges, but I tried to put them in writing and maybe, just maybe, leaving it to the experts to do computer graphics. But I always had a sense of feeling like there was something I was missing. And with the purchase of a new computer to do video capture, I thought, well, here's something really powerful, and I've heard there are these worlds that I could create in something called Blender. So I decided to take a shot to see where 3D programs had progressed to in the last 24 years. This, I feel, is an opportunity to look at how something has been maturing over time, and coming back to it gives perspective on what works and what didn't, and what people thought was very important to innovate and create with, and what fell by the wayside. Walking into Blender at 50 is quite an experience. It is clear that this product is very, very mature. It has progressed from not only doing the job correctly and getting it done quickly, it has become a multifaceted tool that is rapidly moving in every direction related to images and integration of sound, animation, and other factors to produce art. My experience and love of ray tracing had come utilizing a text-only interface where you essentially wrote a script or a set of instructions that a renderer would then work with. This meant that you worked in primitives and then moved those primitives around trying to figure out how the scene would look at the end. As you can imagine, this approach favors geometry and very simple architecture. Organic shapes have to be produced either using additional math or just lots of different factors of randomness, interaction, and then waiting to see what came out the other end. It also meant that you were looking at these scenes as a canvas. You would have in your mind a single image and build a world around it. You could animate, but it would be painful, a huge, long process with lots of wasted time making it happen, with no hope of it ever looking realistic. This is in many ways the source of what people use in vaporwave and other aesthetic outlooks, making fun of how smooth and perfect This canvas approach worked for me. Thinking of everything as a simple, straightforward drawing where I was using different tools is a function of being a cartoonist first and an artist second. I liked having a simple idea portrayed simply. I liked watching lights interact in ray tracing. I loved reflectiveness, and I really enjoyed things like repeating patterns, moving into infinity. All of these, though, are looks that quickly wear down your audience. They have no interest in looking at yet another checkerboard with yet another reflective sphere. Almost as soon as this look was new, it was old, tired, a design on a napkin or the side of a cup instead of a frame. Blender, though, considers this approach to drawing to be one of a multifaceted diamond of different possibilities involving images and sound and animation. When you work on a scene, that scene is a point in time, and constructed into the entire process is the idea that this is but one frame inside of an animation. You may choose, as I would, to stay with one frame, but you could very quickly add the fourth dimension of time onto whatever you're doing and begin designing some sort of movie. Additionally, I found that there were entire realms of images you could work with. A system called Grease Pencil, meant to integrate hand-drawn works into a 3D space, allowing you, in some ways, to create 3D objects. And I'd also seen that this was at 3.0 and had integrated endless amounts of plugins, scripts, and the ability to hook in all sorts of programs that people had written. What this meant was that the near infinite possibilities that any drawing program presents for me had become infinity squared, infinities upon infinities upon infinities. Not just drawing on a paper, but drawing on any surface, and drawing through time, and all different ways of getting to the end of portraying what you had in your mind for people to see. After installation, I tried just using Blender, just putting it up and letting it work intuitively. This turned out to be a failure. Blender is not intuitive. It follows the rules that have been built up in 3D rendering and 3D programming and 3D scene creation. But these conventions are not universal conventions. They're not a piece of paper that you're writing on when you use a word processor, or a film strip or video that you scrub to the beginning or the end like you do with video editing. This was its own thing. Its very own world that had built up over decades and was using the key presses, the names, and the integrations of that particular industry, the industry of computer graphics. Luckily, I had two tools that I would have never been able to get back in 1996. A near infinite library of example files that I could download, where people would create a scene of a house or an object and then allow you to immediately, instantly download it into your copy of Blender, play with it, try to figure out how it all worked and what sort of programming they were using. The classic example of how to learn anything digital, which is to start with something complete and then begin chipping away at it to see what's inside. I also had a near infinite collection of tutorials, examples, and walkthroughs. This enabled me to see what people were doing, but more importantly, see how long it took them to do it. And after watching a bunch of videos and loading in a whole bunch of example objects, I have created absolutely nothing. I've not created one scene of my own, one work that has my name and footprint on it, nothing that I can call my own, no first work, nothing to put up on the virtual refrigerator, which I myself have failed to create. No, it's not a case where I'm going to create a whole lot using Blender. But here's what I learned about myself. I recognize that Blender, as a free alternative, has a huge audience, a huge amount of people using it in all different ways. And as a result, there's a secondary market, creating objects, creating scenes and materials, creating plugins, and offering people all sorts of different ways to make everything run faster. And at some point, you start to make the calculus in your life. Do I want to spend a week creating a relatively decent boombox in a 3D program, or would I rather pay somebody $5 for a really well-made one with huge amounts of flexibility reflecting their knowledge of how this program worked? At some point, that $5 seems like a bargain. The same for materials, the same for any sort of pre-made programming for Blender. If I need something, somebody has probably created it for free, for a cheap price, or representing the actual value of how hard it would be to do if I did it myself. In other words, I have a fourth dimension of time too, programmed into the value of whenever I want to do any sort of hobbyist project. It guides me trying to think of what I'm going to do, what I plan to achieve, and whether or not I should be the one doing it. The mechanisms of Blender represent its maturity. It has a method of programming where you create little boxes, and each of those boxes is a function. If you ever played with the toy Capsela, it's a metaphor for programming. Each one of these interlocking blocks does a function and then interacts with other blocks, feeding data or feeding physics through it. That's how you program in Blender. I completely understand this metaphor. There are all sorts of knobs on every single level for manipulating not just light, but how the light acts, how it interacts with other objects, how the objects themselves have properties of physics, gravity, and other forces, with an equivalent number of properties onto the objects themselves. You can manipulate your camera, give it names, produce not just lighting and physical objects, but interrelations between all those items so that later, in animation, they affect each other without you having to play a part. Imagine being able to create 100 spheres in space and then saying, for the next 30 seconds, have these properties of physics and fall amongst each other, producing a randomized pattern, and then leaving it there. Those knobs, those abilities are all lying there. At the end of those weeks of exploration with Blender, I came to a conclusion, which was I hadn't done the fundamental work to be able to use this program. I didn't have a single idea. Tools are meaningless unless you apply your ideas and your creativity through them. But I was just fooling around, trying to imagine how these programs worked and being allured by the idea of a modern version of something I once used. But back when I was using 3D programs, I had ideas overflowing, pulling all of these ideas apart and putting them back together again in a beautiful but ugly weirdness that I could call my own. This wasn't the case here. I was taking a car for a test drive, but not thinking about what destinations I might want to drive to, or even who would come along with me, or what I was even looking for in the experience of a drive. What I know is that everything has progressed incredibly in 3D work. This machine, this program, this set of paradigms is fascinating. I'm still looking at tutorial videos, being amazed at what people do. But even within these videos, I see all of the unspoken, subconscious breathing of hitting different options and tabs that fundamentally change how things are rendered and how things work. I have many skills in my background that have all sorts of unconscious parts, things that I just know, the paradigm that puts them together, why they were programmed the way they are, and what you have to do to either work around them or work with them. I've seen cases where people create very realistic, very evocative scenes using a few small lines and settings, while others would have to spend hours by hand placing things in different locations, unaware that there sits nearby one setting that would enable all of that work done in an instant. And at my age, I don't know if I can fully ingest the pain of knowing that the last 2 hours I spent could have been done in no time at all. So now that I've verified that Blender is everything it's cracked up to be, I've begun work on the most important step of all, walking through my own imagination to see if there's a dream, a long-buried hope of creating something beautiful, breathtaking, and give it the life and support that it deserves. And maybe it's a sign of how lucky I am that after spending a lot of time trying to think of what I have unfulfilled, what creative urges never got a chance to express themselves in my life, it seems to be that there are very, very few. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. Thanks to James Bekoyanu, Mark Pilgrim, Peter Healy, Emilio Oliveira, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Matt Reynolds, Manxalot, John Sturm, Trixie the Cat, Dileep Reddy, Sean Kelly, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. One nice side effect of working with Blender and having to go through all of these creative works is reawakening a memory where I would find all sorts of bound art books out in the world, either at bookstores or in the offices of people who did design, where I could see each page being a different artist and them showing the best of what they've done. These books are kind of a compilation of what design talent is out there. It reminds me how much of a variation of art and visualization and work is out there, and how it's something that I keep in the back of my mind to constantly shake up my awareness of what the possibilities are, and being able later to remember that I saw this one approach that now is exactly what I need. And maybe we need to add another dimension for everything.